This is the story of how ambition, empire, and modernization led Russia and Japan into a conflict that surprised the entire world. The Russo, Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 was one of the most surprising conflicts of the early 20th century. It was fought between the Russian Empire, one of the largest and most powerful nations in the world, and Japan, a rapidly modernizing island nation that had only recently emerged from centuries of isolation. The war took place far from Europe's traditional battlefields, yet its consequences reshaped global politics and changed how nations understood power, modernization, and military strength. To understand why Russia and Japan went to war, it is necessary to look at the changing political situation in East Asia during the late 19th century. For centuries, China had been the dominant regional power, while Korea existed as an independent kingdom influenced by Chinese culture and diplomacy. Japan, meanwhile, had remained largely closed to foreign contact under the rule of the Tokugawa shogunate. This situation changed dramatically in the 1850s when Western powers forced Japan to open its ports to international trade. Japanese leaders soon realized that survival in a world dominated by industrial empires required rapid modernization. Beginning in 1868, during the period known as the Meiji Restoration, Japan transformed its government, economy, and military along modern European lines. Railways were constructed, industries developed, and a modern army and navy were built using Western technology and training methods. Within only a few decades, Japan had become an industrial and military power capable of competing beyond its islands. At the same time, the Russian Empire was expanding eastward across Asia. Russia had already reached the Pacific Ocean through Siberia and sought warm water ports that would remain usable year-round. Much of Russia's eastern coastline froze during winter, limiting naval operations. Control of ports in Manchuria and influence over Korea therefore became strategic priorities. Both Russia and Japan increasingly viewed Korea as essential to their security. Japanese leaders believed that if another great power controlled Korea, Japan itself could be threatened. Russian officials saw the region as an opportunity to extend influence and secure access to the Pacific. Tension between regional powers first intensified during the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895. Japan defeated China and gained influence over Korea as well as control of territories, including Taiwan. However, soon after the victory, Russia joined France and Germany in what became known as the Triple Intervention, forcing Japan to return the Liaodong Peninsula to China. This diplomatic humiliation left a lasting impression in Japan. Many Japanese leaders concluded that Western powers respected strength above all else. Determination grew within Japan to expand military capability and prevent future interference. Ironically, only a few years later, Russia secured a lease over the very territory it had denied Japan. Russian forces occupied Port Arthur on the Liaodong Peninsula and began constructing naval facilities there. The Trans-Siberian Railway, stretching across thousands of kilometers, was expanded to connect European Russia with its eastern territories and military positions in Manchuria. Russian presence in the region increased steadily after the Boxer Rebellion in China around 1900. Although foreign troops were supposed to withdraw afterward, Russian forces remained in Manchuria, strengthening infrastructure and military defenses. Japan viewed this continued occupation as a direct threat. Diplomatic negotiations took place between Russia and Japan during the early 1900s. Japan proposed recognizing Russian influence in Manchuria if Russia acknowledged Japanese interests in Korea. Russian leadership delayed negotiations repeatedly, believing Japan would not risk war against a major European empire. These delays frustrated Japanese officials. Many believed that waiting would only allow Russia to strengthen its military position further. Japanese leaders concluded that decisive action might be necessary before Russian power in the region became overwhelming. By early 1904, negotiations collapsed. Japan made the decision to strike before formally declaring war, hoping to gain strategic advantage through surprise. On the night of February 8, 1904, Japanese naval forces launched a sudden attack on the Russian fleet stationed at Port Arthur. Torpedo boats struck anchored Russian warships, damaging several vessels. Although not completely destroying the fleet, the attack marked the beginning of open conflict. The following day, Japan formally declared war on Russia. The conflict shocked observers around the world. Many European leaders assumed Russia's size and resources guaranteed victory. Few expected Japan to challenge, let alone defeat, a major imperial power. Japanese forces quickly moved to land troops on the Korean peninsula, securing control and advancing north toward Manchuria. Efficient planning and disciplined coordination allowed Japanese armies to move rapidly despite difficult terrain and harsh winter conditions. Russian forces faced enormous logistical challenges. The Trans-Siberian Railway, though impressive, remained incomplete in sections and could transport only limited numbers of troops and supplies at a time. Reinforcements traveling from western Russia required weeks to reach the front. Early land battles demonstrated Japanese preparedness. Engagements along the Yalu River in April 1904 resulted in Japanese victory, pushing Russian troops back into Manchuria. Japanese commanders emphasized careful planning, artillery coordination, and aggressive maneuvering. Meanwhile, the siege of Port Arthur became one of the central struggles of the war. Japanese forces surrounded the heavily fortified port, determined to eliminate Russia's Pacific naval presence. Fighting there would become prolonged and costly, involving trench warfare, artillery bombardment, and repeated assaults against fortified positions. As the months passed, the war expanded across land and sea. Both nations committed increasing resources. Casualties mounted. Observers worldwide followed developments closely, recognizing that the outcome might redefine assumptions about military power and modernization. The Russo, Japanese War was becoming not only a regional conflict, but a global turning point demonstrating that industrial strength, organization, and strategy could outweigh sheer size. As the war continued through 1904, fighting intensified across both land and sea. Japanese strategy focused on maintaining momentum while preventing Russian forces from consolidating their strength in Manchuria. Speed and coordination were essential because Japanese leaders understood that Russia possessed vast reserves of manpower that could eventually overwhelm them if given enough time. After securing Korea, Japanese armies crossed into southern Manchuria and advanced toward major Russian defensive positions. The geography of the region played an important role in shaping military operations. Manchuria consisted of wide plains, river valleys, and railway lines that determined how armies could move and supply themselves. Control of railways became nearly as important as victory in battle. One of the earliest major confrontations occurred along the Yalu River, which formed part of the boundary between Korea and Manchuria. In April 1904, Japanese forces launched a carefully planned assault against Russian defensive positions. Using artillery preparation and coordinated infantry movement, Japanese troops successfully forced Russian units to retreat. The victory demonstrated that Japan's modernized army could defeat European-trained forces in open battle. Following this success, Japanese armies pushed deeper into Manchuria. Their objective was to isolate Port Arthur while preventing Russian reinforcements from arriving from the north. Multiple Japanese armies advanced simultaneously, creating pressure along a wide front. Meanwhile, the siege of Port Arthur became one of the most brutal chapters of the war. The port was heavily fortified with coastal guns, trenches, barbed wire, and elevated defensive positions overlooking surrounding terrain. Russian defenders believed the fortress could resist for many months. Japanese forces surrounded the city and began systematic siege operations during the summer of 1904. Instead of immediate victory, the siege developed into slow and exhausting warfare. Soldiers dug trenches, constructed artillery positions, and launched repeated assaults against fortified hills protecting the harbor. The fighting revealed the deadly effectiveness of modern weapons. Machine guns and rapid-firing artillery caused heavy casualties during frontal attacks. Japanese troops repeatedly advanced under intense fire, suffering enormous losses while attempting to capture strategic heights, such as Hill 203, which overlooked the harbor. Control of this hill proved decisive. After weeks of fierce combat late in 1904, Japanese forces finally captured the position. From there, artillery observers directed heavy bombardment onto Russian warships anchored below. One by one, major vessels of the Russian Pacific Fleet were destroyed or disabled. The fall of Port Arthur became inevitable. In January 1905, the Russian commander surrendered the fortress along with thousands of soldiers. The loss shocked Russia and greatly strengthened Japanese morale. It eliminated Russia's primary naval base in the Pacific and marked one of Japan's most important victories. While the siege unfolded in the south, massive land battles developed farther north. Russian commanders attempted to halt Japanese advances near the city of Liaoyang in August and September 1904. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers participated, making it one of the largest battles fought up to that time. Despite strong defensive positions, Russian coordination problems allowed Japanese forces to outmaneuver them. After days of fighting, Russian troops withdrew again, abandoning another strategic position. Retreat became a recurring pattern as Russian commanders struggled with communication difficulties and uncertainty about Japanese strength. The Russian army faced serious logistical challenges. Supplies and reinforcements traveled thousands of kilometers along the Trans-Siberian Railway, which remained vulnerable to congestion and delays. Soldiers arriving at the front were often exhausted from long journeys. Equipment shortages and harsh weather conditions further complicated operations. Morale within Russian ranks declined as defeats accumulated. Many soldiers questioned leadership decisions, while news from home reported growing social unrest. The war placed enormous strain on the Russian Empire, exposing weaknesses within its military and administrative systems. Japan also faced difficulties despite its victories. Casualties were extremely high, and maintaining long supply lines across the sea required constant naval protection. Japan's economy was under heavy pressure from wartime spending. Leaders understood that prolonged conflict could become dangerous if quick success was not achieved. In early 1905, the largest land battle of the war took place near Mukden, one of Manchuria's major cities. Beginning in February, hundreds of thousands of troops clashed across a vast front stretching many kilometers. Fighting continued for weeks in freezing conditions. Japanese forces attempted wide, flanking movements designed to encircle Russian armies. After intense combat and mounting losses on both sides, Russian commanders ordered another withdrawal northward. The Battle of Mukden became one of the largest battles fought before the First World War, involving more than 500,000 soldiers combined. The retreat from Mukden further weakened Russian confidence and strengthened international recognition of Japan's military effectiveness. Observers around the world began reconsidering assumptions about European superiority in warfare. Yet one decisive confrontation still remained at sea. Russia had dispatched its Baltic fleet on an extraordinary journey around the world to reinforce its naval position in the Pacific. The fleet sailed thousands of kilometers from Europe, passing Africa and Asia in an effort to challenge Japanese naval control. As this fleet approached East Asian waters in 1905, both nations prepared for what would become the final and most decisive engagement of the war. By the spring of 1905, attention across the world turned toward the sea. Although Japan had achieved major victories on land and captured Port Arthur, Russia still hoped to reverse the course of the war through naval power. The Russian government placed enormous expectations on the Baltic Fleet, officially known as the Second Pacific Squadron, which had begun one of the longest naval journeys ever attempted in wartime. The fleet departed from ports in the Baltic Sea in October 1904. Its mission was simple in theory, but extremely difficult in practice. Russian warships needed to travel more than 18,000 nautical miles to reach East Asia and confront the Japanese Navy. The journey required sailing around Europe, down the coast of Africa, across the Indian Ocean, and toward the Pacific. The voyage placed immense strain on both ships and sailors. Coal-powered battleships required frequent refueling stops, yet many nations were unwilling to openly assist Russia due to neutrality concerns. Crews endured exhaustion, mechanical failures, and constant tension as they traveled through unfamiliar waters. During the journey, an incident known as the Dogger Bank Affair nearly caused another international crisis. Russian ships mistakenly fired upon British fishing vessels in the North Sea after believing they were under attack by Japanese torpedo boats. Several fishermen were killed, and relations between Russia and Britain became dangerously strained. Diplomacy eventually prevented escalation, but the event demonstrated the nervous condition of Russian sailors after months at sea. Meanwhile, Japan carefully prepared its navy under the leadership of Admiral Togo Hayakairo. Japanese naval strategy emphasized speed, discipline, and coordinated gunnery. Japanese ships operated closer to home bases, allowing crews to remain rested and well-supplied. By May 1905, Russian ships finally approached the waters between Korea and Japan, known as the Tsushima Strait. This narrow passage represented the fastest route toward Vladivostok, Russia's remaining Pacific port. Japanese intelligence successfully tracked the approaching fleet and positioned forces to intercept. On May 27, 1905, the Battle of Tsushima began. It quickly became one of the most decisive naval battles in modern history. Admiral Togo maneuvered his fleet across the path of the Russian ships in a tactical movement that allowed Japanese battleships to concentrate fire on leading enemy vessels. Japanese gunnery proved highly accurate. Within hours, several Russian ships were heavily damaged or sinking. Communication within a Russian fleet broke down as formations scattered under intense bombardment. Many vessels were already worn from their long voyage and struggled to respond effectively. Fighting continued into the night as Japanese destroyers and torpedo boats launched attacks against surviving ships. By the following day, the Russian fleet had been almost completely destroyed. Many ships sank, others surrendered, and only a few managed to escape. The scale of defeat stunned the world. Russia lost most of its fleet, thousands of sailors were killed or captured, and hopes of regaining naval control vanished. Japan's victory demonstrated that careful planning, training, and modern tactics could overcome even larger imperial forces. The Battle of Tsushima marked the effective end of major combat operations. Russia faced growing internal problems at home. Economic hardship, military defeats, and dissatisfaction with government leadership contributed to widespread unrest. Strikes and protests spread across Russian cities during 1905, creating pressure on Tsar Nicholas II to end the conflict. Japan also faced exhaustion despite victory. Casualties from land battles and the siege of Port Arthur had been severe. Financial resources were stretched, and leaders understood that continuing the war indefinitely carried serious risks. Both nations therefore became open to peace negotiations. United States President Theodore Roosevelt offered to mediate discussions between Russia and Japan. Talks were arranged in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, during the summer of 1905. Delegations from both countries arrived seeking acceptable terms while attempting to preserve national pride. Japan entered negotiations from a position of military success but faced economic strain. Russia sought to avoid humiliation while ending a costly and unpopular war. Negotiations were tense and complex. Japan demanded recognition of its interests in Korea and influence in southern Manchuria. Russia resisted financial reparations but gradually accepted territorial concessions. As discussions progressed, the foundations of a peace agreement began to take shape, bringing the conflict closer to its conclusion and preparing the world for the long-lasting consequences that would follow. In September 1905, representatives of Russia and Japan signed the Treaty of Portsmouth, formally ending the Russo-Japanese War. The agreement marked the conclusion of a conflict that had lasted little more than a year and a half. Yet its effects would echo far beyond East Asia for decades to come. Under the terms of the treaty, Russia recognized Japan's dominant political and military influence over Korea. This recognition allowed Japan to strengthen control over the Korean peninsula, which would later become formally annexed by Japan in 1910. Russia also agreed to withdraw its forces from southern Manchuria and transferred its lease of the Liaodong Peninsula, including Port Arthur and nearby railway rights, to Japan. Additionally, the southern half of Sakhalin Island was ceded to Japan. Although Japan had hoped to receive financial compensation for the enormous cost of the war, Russia refused to pay reparations, and Japanese negotiators ultimately accepted peace without monetary payment in order to end the conflict quickly. Despite victory, news of the treaty caused unexpected unrest within Japan. Many citizens believed their sacrifices deserved greater rewards. Large public demonstrations erupted in Tokyo, reflecting frustration that the final agreement appeared less decisive than battlefield victory suggested. The government responded by restoring order while emphasizing that long-term security had been achieved. In Russia, the consequences were even more serious. Military defeat exposed deep weaknesses within the imperial system. Public confidence in the government declined sharply, contributing to the revolution of 1905. Workers organized strikes, peasants protested economic hardship, and segments of the military expressed dissatisfaction with leadership. Facing growing unrest, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to introduce limited political reforms, including the creation of a legislative assembly known as the Duma. Although these reforms did not fully resolve internal tensions, the war had permanently weakened the authority of the Russian monarchy and revealed vulnerabilities that would later contribute to the revolutions of 1917. International observers carefully studied the outcome of the war. For the first time in modern history, an Asian nation had defeated a major European empire in a large-scale industrial conflict. This event challenged long-held assumptions about global hierarchy and colonial dominance. Across Asia and parts of Africa, nationalist movements drew inspiration from Japan's victory. Intellectuals and political leaders saw proof that modernization and organization could allow non-European nations to resist imperial control. Japan's success, therefore, carried symbolic importance far beyond military achievement. Military strategists also learned important lessons from the conflict. The war demonstrated the growing importance of modern artillery, machine guns, trenches, and fortified defensive systems. Many features later seen during the First World War were already visible in battles, such as Port Arthur and Mukden. Observers noted how industrial technology had increased the destructive power of warfare while making decisive victories more costly. Naval warfare underwent transformation as well. The Battle of Tsushima confirmed the importance of heavily armed battleships, long-range gunnery, wireless communication, and coordinated fleet maneuvering. Navies around the world accelerated modernization programs, contributing to global naval competition in the years before 1914. For Japan, victory elevated its status to that of a recognized great power. The nation gained influence in international diplomacy and expanded its presence across East Asia. However, success also encouraged future expansionist ambitions that would shape regional conflicts in the decades ahead. For ordinary soldiers and civilians, the war left quieter but lasting memories. Thousands of families in both nations mourned lost relatives. Soldiers endured extreme cold, disease, hunger, and exhaustion in distant landscapes far from home. Medical services struggled to cope with modern battlefield injuries, while journalists and observers reported the emotional strain carried by those who survived. The conflict also marked an era when photography and international reporting brought distant wars closer to public awareness. Newspapers across Europe, Asia, and the Americas followed developments daily, creating one of the first truly global media covered wars. In the years that followed, tensions among major powers continued to rise elsewhere in the world. Alliances strengthened, military planning intensified, and technological competition accelerated. Many historians later viewed the Russo-Japanese War as a warning sign of the larger global conflict that would begin less than a decade later with the outbreak of the First World War. The war demonstrated that industrial age conflicts could mobilize entire societies, strain economies, and reshape political systems even when fought far from traditional centers of power. It revealed how ambition, fear, and competition for influence could draw nations into confrontation despite diplomatic efforts. As the early 20th century moved forward, memories of the war remained present in military academies, political discussions, and international relations. Its lessons influenced commanders, reformers, and revolutionaries alike. The Russo-Japanese War, therefore, stands not only as a regional struggle between two empires, but as a turning point in modern history. It reshaped expectations about power, accelerated political change within Russia, elevated Japan onto the global stage, and signaled the arrival of a new and more uncertain international era. And as the guns finally fell silent across Manchuria and the waters of the Tsushima Strait grew calm once more, the world quietly entered a new century shaped by industrial strength, national ambition, and the growing realization that future wars would become even larger and more transformative than those that had come before.